Okay, so we're recording
All right.
now. How about you introduce yourself first?
Oh yeah. Okay. So I'm Baroque Spiral. My real name is not all that hard to find, which is a little worrying considering I appear to have stalkers now. But um, I'm not going to go out of my way to advertise it. You can find it if you want.
hmm
Um, I'm I'm a PhD student at University of Western Ontario, in theory and criticism. Actually, that alone will give it away if you compare. But
I mean, how many are there? You know?
and publisher at um at Ondata, one of the producer is my official job title at Ondata Express, which is a Toronto-based, mostly online micro publisher with a sort of multimedia focus. Um,
They publish some great
and
stuff.
I dedicate a lot of my own time to like both my own fiction and theory writing, and I guess being a kind of way too online internet cultural commentator.
Yeah, that's a good description. So I guess a little bit about myself. I'm Nico Villarreal. I have a Substack where I post increasingly unintelligible things. Um, Recently it's been about AI and semiotics, but it's also been about like political theory, political economy, all kinds of things like that. I publish sometimes with Cosmonaut and Palladium magazine. I'm pretty sure I'm the only person to have done that. Not that anyone cares, but that's where you can find my stuff. Um, and I have been truly obsessed with some of your writing recently, especially The Theory of the Young Boy, which I think is an incredible work of modern cultural criticism. Probably the best, in my opinion, in the past 10 years. Although, admittedly,
Thanks.
there's many I haven't read, but I think it's amazing. So,
Thanks. And the irony is, as soon as you get down to the stratum of something like Theory of the Young Boy, it's almost impossible to know how many you haven't read because
yeah.
it's below the level of the canon. It's or not even the canon, but the publishing world meta. And I guess that's part of something we're going to come back to at various points over this, which is just how slow that world has been to catch up to the internet.
hmm
And
Well, the
like,
closest thing that I could think of was Kill All Normies, which
right,
what's her name published with Zero Books back
Angela
in the day.
Nagel.
Angela Nagel, who has since gone off the deep end, and so has Zero Books, or the publisher of it, Doug Lane. But that was, I thought, not a perfect book, but a good documentation of what was going on online in that time period. And this, I think, goes much further than that because it is good documentation, but you have this uncanny ability to know when signifiers and signifieds are like shaping, like moving in real time, how cultural dynamics are shifting and the motivation behind those shifts, which I feel is very impressive.
Thanks. I mean, the thing that drove me crazy about Kill All Normies, and yeah, it's the one that anybody in my program say will bring up when talking about this kind of
Uh huh.
cultural shift. Even the people who are relatively like who are not the kind of identity politics critical leftist she was at the time, it's the one they know. But like the thing that drove me kind of crazy about it is almost everything she cites from news articles. Like,
Oh yeah.
uh, I was working at also on a more sort of detailed object level history called The Great Defamiliarization, which is probably never getting finished. But, like, to really get into the meat of, like, I mean, like any history, you
Mhm.
have to look at primary sources, not just secondary sources.
Yeah.
And a thing I struggle with even a lot of like online, like I've heard podcasts covering like online history recently, and a lot of what everyone cites is secondary sources, which are in an entirely different media stratum than the things they're commenting on.
Hmm. No, I totally get what you mean because before I got involved in theory and socialism or anything particularly political, I was a poster and article writer on Know Your Meme. And
Holy shit.
and that was my like obsession thing was like I need to document memes because this is like the thing that matters now. And I wrote a few articles about random things, probably that I didn't fully understand all the dimensions of. But the thing about the internet is that it's all right there. It's all you can just look at the things being posted and understand what's going on. Um, and as the culture wars developed and the way like Wikipedia could only, like Angela Nagel, cite the secondary sources, and I could see how that was creating a distortion of what was really going on in certain situations. It was very frustrating. So I know exactly what you mean.
Yeah, and Know Your Meme does much better at that than most other sites, and I'd cite it. And even then, there's stuff that I recall, like, and I'm struggling with the specifics, but stuff where I'll go to know Your Meme, and like the first documented instance on there is like I know for a fact that's not where it started.
Yeah.
Like a lot of the time it'll be like a Reddit post or something. It's like, yeah, this was circulating on 4chan for like 10 months earlier.
No,
Uh,
literally.
4chan of all things is
Yeah. Well, it's
not
harder on
that
4chan because
hard.
they'll delete stuff, but the I know exactly what you're talking about because that happened to literally a meme that I made once. And I had to correct them. I was like, no, that's not the source of that. I posted that first, and it was here like months before that. But sometimes people half-ass it, but it is generally more reliable on those type of
Yeah,
things.
it's very hard
Yeah.
because like the spaces aren't all visible from each other
Hmm.
where the stuff is
That's true.
circulating. And 4chan, for what it's worth, is like actually not like people treat it like this black hole, but it's
No,
actually relatively well documented because it has these like perpetually updating archives,
that's true.
like just multiple offsite mirrors that archive 4chan content.
Hmm.
And they're pretty intuitive to search, and I can get a lot out of like just searching keywords in them. But um other sites like I don't know how the fuck to find old shit on Tumblr
Oh yeah,
because
that's fucked. It's so hard to find even like when was this posted? Is
yeah,
it's they hide the date sometimes, like the usual UI, um, and it's really a mess. Like it's um, I don't know. Tumblr has always been a mess. I that was the other thing. I was on Know Your Meme and Tumblr back in like 2013 before everything blew up. Um,
wow,
it's just such a funny combination in retrospect.
yeah.
But
I
what?
mean, infamously part of my backstory and correcting the record to the person who's stalking me on poll here, I was on 4chan and Tumblr at the same time around this period.
Mhm.
Like
Well, it's
that's my like I'm for Tumblr the person.
um, but why don't you tell people a bit about uh, the theory of the young boy?
Serious young boy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so it's already it's a reference to and a takeoff on Tikkun's Preliminary Materials for a Theory of the Young Girl, which was a text that was and still is, I feel like, very big in kind of art world subculture in the 2010s. It's like from the 90s in France and got translated into English around like 2000s or 2010 or something. I'm blanking on the year. Um, by Ariana Reigns. And it's this text that uses the young girl capitalized with capitalized and hyphenated, which is a somewhat more conventional French usage, as a figure for the ideal consumer subject of the end of history, the kind of global empire that seemed to have swallowed everything after the fall of the Soviet Union. Is almost in some ways like a replacement for concept for like Nietzsche's Last Man. Has a lot of the same
Hmm.
resonances, but in the form of this sort of there's simultaneously a Nietzschean spirit of like self-fashioning of kind of like this hardness and duty to excel in being a media object, in being the object of desire, which the idea for Tikkun is that, like, this is not specific to young girls. This is everybody. They
Hmm.
have some, like, famous lines about that that I won't quote because they contain, like, French racial slurs. But, like, and these are not, like, right wing guys. I mean, they are kind of, you can hear in Tikkun in the way they write, like, the origins of today's kind of like post left Angela Nagel types or even Red Scare types.
Hmm.
But this was at a point in history when all those ideas were still left coded, albeit within a kind of politically incorrect, edgy Gen X left. And they got reappropriated through like the book was very popular in relatively woke kind of art world spaces, among a lot of women who used it as a kind of like auto critique. I think especially like women who grew up in the 90s, grew up in like that era of like Britney Spears and like uh anorexic model, like that whole kind of like
Hmm.
almost as a with a lot of people like exploring that as simultaneously a kind of childhood and adult trauma and the need to keep like reenacting all these imperatives of production of one's body and image as a virtual commodity, even if you know that's like wrong, but it also seems not even like wrong or it's like it's not what you want, but like what else is there? It's not even again simultaneously. It's like blasted at you at like MK Ultra frequencies if you're being raised as a girl in the 90s, but
Hmm.
also when you're outside that, it's like no, everybody else is doing the same thing. It's not like there's some
Right.
like radically other it's almost not like you can just as easily sort of refuse to be a woman as like a radical feminist in the 70s might have
Hmm.
wanted to make it out to be.
Well, so now,
And
but
so it,
I think what you kind of say in the book is, well, now you can kind of refuse in the
yeah,
sense that you can become a young boy instead.
yes, which ironically, that the first chapter deals with this dialectic, ironically contains and is contained in a lot of the young girl. Like I keep watching the almost like the the internal dialectics between these shift, but yeah, the young boy is the subject that emerges in response to this, in my view, because Tikkun thought like, okay, like basically there's not going to be anything other than this until the revolution. Although they also kind of have their own thing, the bloom. It's like the bloom is this
Hmm.
last exhausted remnant of humanity, the sort of like I want to say almost like a kind of Zizekian. All of this is pretty Zizekian subject.
Hmm.
Um, but what I felt that they were actually like speaking from when I read Theory of the Young Boy and thought like Theory of the Young Girl. Like this is no, there all the sort of critiques that are fairly obvious of their metaphor and system. Like, yes, it's misogynistic. Yeah, it also has this kind of like element of reality. And the missing element is the subject it creates in response, in negation to this, which is the young boy, which um, I characterized by the shift from like mass mass media spectacle of the late 20th century to the internet, to formats that are more decentralized, more text based, but also like very centralized in the kinds of like platform architectures that run them, that's like very sort of character, like the young girl is characterized by an absolute affirmation. This is one thing they go a lot into, like the language of like self-help
Hmm.
magazines and stuff, and like a kind of realism. There's simultaneously this aspirational, like you're trying to become the best you can be, but the you is unconditionally grounded in an affirmed material life, which doesn't allow for like uh, doesn't allow for metaphysics, doesn't allow for politics, doesn't allow for negation. And for the young boy, all of those things are like essentially the objects of play. They are sort of living in a digital world. They're like the main things he can do. And the play that they he engages them in is overwhelmingly violent. It aims at a negation of other young boys, of young girls, and of like the world as such. Um, but this does end up affirming and becoming part of the system because, and this is a big part of the argument, that it's like the different elements, because they're all constructed in this negative reaction to the young girl, they fit together in a kind of algorithm where the negative force can't be directed at the actual the actual structures of the system because those are too real, too kind of like even acknowledging them would require conceding too much of the logic of the young girl reality principle.
Hmm.
So they always end up being directed at sort of another step in the algorithm. So if you look at like internet discourse and like even
Hmm.
the way we're talking about discourse, the whole fact of talking about like like this was not a thing 15 years ago. Like in fact, I remember when people started using that term on Tumblr, on like
Yeah.
sort of esoteric Marxist um
Well, listen.
Tumblr around 2013, like former laissez-faire people, I
uh,
want to say, pioneered it.
I
I
mean, well,
remember
it's a
this one
specifically
post.
like Foucauldian term that. uh,
Yeah,
very popular in academia around the time. But
yeah.
continue. Um,
Maybe this post like, walk up in the club like Hegel, like walk up to the club like, what do you contribute to the discourse? Walk up to the club like Hegel. That's like my first memory of it being used in anything like the contemporary sense, and now that is just everywhere.
hmm
Um, and it is like possibly a major form of popular entertainment. Like it's arguably supplanted, and when I say supplanted, like we can say it has many of the same characteristics at the same time. What would have been probably one of the most archetypally young girl forms of popular entertainment, which was reality TV.
Yeah. And like reality TV, it has a certain kayfabe to it. It's not real a lot of times. Um, you can see like how if you pay attention to when discourse posts go viral, there's a lot of repetition. It's like we've done this discourse before, but it still keeps going viral because it hits some kind of like nail in people's like semiotic web of like meaning. Um,
Right.
and you can't get. But I want to go back to what you were talking about um, with um, the things, the inability of the young boy to really pick up on the system itself and try to explode it somehow or disrupt it or change it, however you want.
Yeah.
Um,
And I
because
mean, this is going to sound. This sounds almost like smug and meaningless because I don't want it to sound like, oh, I'm the smart academic Marxist who knows how to blow up the system. Like, at a very basic sort of prior level, like, yeah, obviously the young boy doesn't know how to do this. Nobody's known how to do this for, like, almost a century now.
yeah,
Like,
but I
but
I, I do think
mhm.
that whatever they pick up on,
Nobody knows what they want to replace it with, which is,
yeah.
I'd say, more important and specifically to the thing of the young boy, because that's what the young boy almost categorically cannot think about.
Well, I mean, it's. I think we are a little bit past capitalist realism now, in the sense that like the MAGA comms have a vision of like China
Right.
2060 or something, and the traditionalists have their own kind of field of wheat kind of nonsense. Um, but I think that there's a more. So here's what I've come to think about it, and this comes from the research I've been doing on semiotics and AI and all that stuff, because it's actually quite. If you think conceptually about the problem of meaning, of how do you know that this sign, this symbol or signifier, that how do you know that this is always going to stand in for the thing you associate it with? You know, uh,
Mhm.
so with the young boy, every time there's like a flashpoint of this in our culture, of some attempt to try to disrupt the system, they are always targeting something which is correlated to the system, right?
Yes.
And that's how you create a sign. You recognize some correlation, and you now when you see the appearance of it, it means this broader thing. But how do you know that it means the full thing that you associate with it is the problem, right? Um, so like uh, anonymous attacking the Westboro Baptist Church or something, or MAGA comms identifying Trump as like, or not Trump, but MAGA as a point of resistance to this system, or the alt right did something similar. I mean, there's all kinds of different things that people identified with the system, right? And that they targeted to try to destroy. Um, and it's and it could be something as stupid as like in Gamergate it was um, like a certain style of like video game and journalism. Um,
Hmm.
and uh, the problem with like those signs is that uh, like they experience what I've started to call sign function collapse, um,
Hmm.
which I don't know if you've uh, got around to reading any of those blogs I wrote on the topic. Um, but basically, the idea was that you have first order signs of things that directly represent reality, like something in the world or something that you think is in the world, and then you have higher order signs which are made up of other signs that you've combined together according to some logic. And um, most things that we experience were at like that we think about concepts that we think about were higher order signs at some point, although a lot of them have experienced sign function collapse. So a simple example might be the word applesauce. That at some point we thought about a combination of apples. We know what apples are and what sauce are, but now applesauce just means the thing that comes in the little plastic container that is applesauce. Um, and usually that kind of collapse isn't doesn't hurt anything. Um, but at some point, like you, when you have a system of signs, like it's supposed to correlate to the real world somehow. But no matter how well developed it is, usually there's going to be somewhere where it breaks down, where
Hmm.
the sign no longer means what you expect it to mean. And this is what's happening, I think, with this like inability to target the system at large because they've identified this one thing with the thing they don't like that with this broader system and um, but they're but they can't think about how exactly like what about how the system what the system is that isn't just that thing. They can't conceptualize it or
Yeah,
operationalize it.
and actually, I think a more precise way of saying this almost is like you can't, or this is something that I've been sort of paying a lot of attention to recently,
Hmm,
is that you can't follow the chain of signs all the way through.
yeah,
Like you can't sort of move all the way from the really higher order sign back to reality, back to the higher order sign or a different sign along the chain, and know where you are consistently, which is a very like cybernetic way of thinking about truth.
exactly.
Um, in
Uh, that's exactly where I got the idea from. Is like trying to like reading semiotics through cybernetics. But I like the thing about it is that like there's better and worse ways of maintaining that chain of signification. Um, and I think that once you have a specific ideology, it kind of ossifies that ability to one create new signs and two to remember like that full chain of signification. And this is so obvious when you look at like Marxist Leninist groups in the present day, or Trotskyist groups, which are the same thing now. Um, which like they have all these positions on like pop frontism or anti-imperialism, which come from like the Third International that you can't question, and nobody like the original reason why they existed. Not many people could tell you, um, and this is, I think, a uh, a more solidified example of exactly this kind of thing because the like when each of these movements kind of collapsed, these online movements, it was because this set of signs and the ideology that they created about what the system was and what it was associated with started to break down. and because they didn't have like an engine or a machine of signification that could allow them to um, better like one even the most simple thing of associating new things with that system with themselves and with
Mhm.
internally basically.
Yeah. No, I think, and that gets close to something that's very important for thinking about the young boy, which is one of the features of the young girl and the historical moment she was characteristic of was being without and against ideology. It's like I don't have an ideology. I just have my life, like my my clothes, my brand, my love life, my like um and this whole kind and there was this very strong current that I remember all through like the 2000s when I was first becoming politically aware, and like Zizek, who I think was another like great proto young boy figure, who just being like, well, we need to bring one, like this is already an ideology. You think you don't have ideology, but you
Hmm.
are in an ideology that tells you that it's not ideology. And two, we need to bring ideology back. Like we need to fight
Yeah.
this unconscious ideology by being consciously ideological. And 20 years later, it's like, hmm, well, that is like finger curls on the monkey's paw. Like, now everybody is consciously ideological. The actual system seems still pretty, like, rigidly secured, but also everybody's, like, everybody kind of wants to kill each other.
Yeah.
And part of what's going on there, I think, is that, like, what ideology means or does for the young boy is it's like cutting off the chain of signifiers is the point. Like using even the signifier as a means of violence against reality is the point. I
Right.
have this line about edginess and how like the sharpness of an edge is how much of the world it cuts off. Um,
That's a good one.
and so like to go um there were 2 points I wanted to return to here. Like you're right to correct me that like no, we're past the capitalist realism stage. We're at in fact the stage where people can very easily just construct sort of ideal worlds in their heads like doing like playing Civ or like a paradox game or
Mm.
whatever. And in a sense, these tend to be almost like recombinatory from the database of ideology, which is what you see in like the
Right.
whole political compass fandom. Um, but like to actually get from here to there, and I do believe somebody could with just enough raw force. There's no reason somebody couldn't, and I think when people say like, oh, like Trump will never actually do like a neo-monarchical restoration in America because he's too dumb and a narcissist, I'm like, I don't know, that feels like cope. But the there's a deeper sense in which all any of these kinds of things would be like enacting your kayfabe on the world by violence. It's like, okay, you have a template. Now, how many people do you need to kill to just tell everyone in the world to live according to your template? And how many of your own people do you need to kill? Or are you going to
Mm.
get killed by because their template differs down to like one Minecraft block? Um,
It's a very idealist
because
mind frame for sure. Um,
yeah, and Marxism has really struggled because I think the problem that on the obverse of this, the problem that I'll see in Marxist discourses and on the left is that there's almost a complete unwillingness to imagine the future concretely in signifiers, to describe what you want, um,
Right.
because that would be idealist and be utopian socialism and like whatever the revolution will be just whatever everyone does when the revolution happens, which
Yeah.
doesn't inspire a lot of confidence in most people and also just doesn't give you much to work with when you're there. And so I think what really needs to be maintained is a dialectic, but like that form of dialectic is itself something that the young boy resists because the young boy identifies negation with complete obliteration.
Hmm. No, I will bring up like there's always two examples I go to of like literature in like that dark era of the post Cold War to like 2011 of capitalist realism that actually did like didn't yield to it. And one of them was Paul Cockshot's book of Towards New Socialism that did dare to like, no, this is what we're going to do. We're going to have we're going to have communes. We're going to have these like cybernetic planning systems that have marketplaces with labor tokens, and it did all that kind of stuff in very like concrete proposals, which I thought was very impressive. That I mean, people rightly criticize him for all kinds of his other stuff. But I think that that was one of the most invaluable books written in like socialism and Marxism in the past 35 years or what have you.
Yeah, I
The
really need to get to that.
Oh, it's fantastic. I think you would have a blast. Um, the other book is Damon and Freedom TM. I kind of think of them as one book, but it has a sequel that was written by Daniel Suarez right in the middle of like the Great Recession and the 2008 crash. And he was a Wall Street guy, but who was like had this is such an imaginative book about what if some guy. So it's actually like a very proto like Silicon Valley guy. This very rich video game developer secretly wrote a bunch of code and put it all like and distributed it like decentralized it, and the code would execute as soon as he died, and it would execute in a way to recruit people and self assemble this like new anti-capitalist like anarcho techno like a trans anarcho what was it called back in the day um with like it was one of those like anarcho tech kind of dreams societies uh where where people like it was written as a thriller of this thing taking over, and but then you realize it's this new society being born and it's absolutely brilliant. um I love that book. I read it in high school actually before I even got into politics proper. um
That sounds incredibly based and just okay. Yeah. Um, where were we? Oh yeah, you were talking about this like anarcho tech thing, which sounded incredibly based.
oh yeah. Damon Freedom TM, incredible books, highly recommend them. Because it was he had this wonderful way. Daniel Suarez had this wonderful way of
Mhm.
talking about the plutocracy that's really behind everything, and these characters that are like such type characters of um, like the international capitalist brutality of like they had this character of this colonel who was would go around and solve all these problems for the bourgeoisie, basically for the plutocracy, um, trying to put down this daemon, this the code that had created this entity, basically in the real world. Um,
This
but
sounds a lot like the villains I'm trying to write for Mercenary Planet.
I still need to get around to reading that. That's on the website, right?
Yeah, on Holocaust.
Yeah, I need to get to that. Um, but I wanted, what was I bringing that up about? It was capitalist realism, um, and the thing that I feel about like the inability to like create something new. I'm not confident, but the thing that I really believe in is uh, cosmonaut's vision of things. That this neo-Kafkaist idea about if we can just create a party that doesn't have the ban on factions and doesn't have the Popular Front that's causing like even CPUSA to keep supporting the Democrats 100 years later. Um, that we
And
could,
the MAGACOM split to do the opposite.
yeah, exactly. They're still doing pop frontism just with the Republican Party. It's insane.
Yeah.
um, but they did
Well,
win.
this is one of the most ironic, I think, developments in the young boy politics, where
Right.
that I think is the most useful to try and explain how it actually operates as a force of recuperation is that, like, you'd think that this abstract negation of everything, you can almost trace like the semiotic shift in the language game of post left, because
Mhm.
like in the 90s when Tikkun were writing, and I think I probably don't know my like anarchoid tendencies well enough, but I think Tikkun could have been like referred to as post left in that era's parlance.
The old
Like,
post left, you mean the
yeah, it
the
would be this like, yeah, absolute rejection of parties, of communism, of cap- capitalism, of like of everything. You would not expect this to form any sort of like popular front with like one of the big two parties, because but when you have absolute negation not operating as a principle that's in itself positive, but as this like semiotic move at every scale, you
mhm.
end up having to take sides compulsively in any sort of binary that is presented to you. Because to ever say, oh no, like actually, and in fact, there's a lot of like even subtler dynamics than this, because a lot of the left does say both sides are bad under the same logic, but like to sort of persistently say both sides are bad, or like almost it implies that there is some undefined like I don't know. I'm I'm having the thing where it's like I actually struggle with the number of layers of like reverse psychology meta I have to operate on here to understand this. But
You're like a little baby. Watch
like,
this.
yeah. Um, but basically the thing that you will see with the contemporary post left is that
Mhm.
like if you dislike the Democrats and dislike the DSA pop fronters or whatever, and just say fuck it, I don't support anybody. They their rhetoric very often was, "Oh, you don't really believe this because you aren't willing to go all the way and commit to
Mhm.
the Republicans." Like it's a
Yeah.
kind of dare. Like um
It- it's funny because I talk about the ossification, but there is still like it's ossification of that like broader ideology, and system of science, but still like trying to like purify that like what's like some so sometimes it is like a very strict ossification. You can't change even the most basic things, but other times, especially for these more fluid online movements, there's a constant chasing of what is like the ultimate opposition, the symbolic opposition specifically to power. Um,
Yeah.
and it reminds me of, and I probably bring this up more than once, this line from my favorite show that we talked about a little bit before we started recording, Durarara, where like the in the show there's like this group called the Dollars, right? um, and they're almost explicitly modeled off of these like early 2010s, late 2000s movements that begin online and have like these incredible social impacts. They show up in cities like capital squares and transform like governments and so on. Although as the show goes on, it kind of reflects the pessimism that happened with that kind of movement. But there's a moment, the first time it happens, that you see what the dollars are and the guy who founded them. There's a line spoken to the guy who founded the dollars, saying, "Soon enough, this won't be enough for you. If you really want to escape everyday life, you have to keep evolving." Um, and
Yeah.
it's that kind of dynamic of if you really want to escape this what is the everyday life of the young girl, you have to keep evolving this symbolic point of resistance.
Right. But I think there's two meanings for to that. And I
Hmm.
think one of the things that like I believe, but I think that these discourses are bad at doing is like if you really want to escape, you have to keep evolving. You have to essentially like keep growing, like dialectically or
Hmm.
organically, like incorporating oppositions and material sort of requirements and all these things that have been identified with identified with an absolutely hostile reality principle, identified with either remaining the young girl or growing up, which are in fact often the same thing.
Hmm.
But like then there's also the sense where it's like you have to keep sort of moving your like Lacanian like objectia around. You have to keep like chasing like a symbolic point of reference that like you'll see those things where people just move all over the political compass and it's like they haven't allowed themselves to evolve at any of those points of the political compass because as soon as they encounter a blockage they have to negate it again
Hmm.
and have to jump somewhere else.
No, for sure. And I think that in the show, there's kind of a reflection of that. In the individual, like individuals can never actually do that overcoming themselves. And
Yeah,
the what we
I don't
see,
know if that's true actually, but
well,
yeah, keep going.
what I would say is that the pattern I predominantly see, and it's the one that I have some personal experience with. It's the one that
Yeah.
happened in Durara, is that this desire to constantly evolve kind of leads to it's one it's born out of that like chuny eighth grade syndrome, self delusion of how you can
Mhm.
create like an impact on the world, how you which is kind of a defensive mechanism of in a world where we lack the socializing institutions we used to have, people self-generate these new codes of behavior that are would basically be classified as a sort of mental illness because they're not normalized.
Mhm.
They can't be. Um,
Mhm.
uh, but um, these happen, and what it leads to, if it's the type that you're constantly trying to evolve and make something happen, that you're really trying to make something happen on your own to shape the world, change it in some way,
Mm-hmm.
to what you want, it can be extremely self-destructive just doing it on your own.
Yes.
And people like we had and I was very familiar with some of the people involved with like Hegelian Eagles thing was kind of a
Oh yeah.
micro explosion of this, which was in many ways a very ambitious attempt to do this kind of precise symbolic intervention to change things, and done on those terms of Lacanian psychoanalysis explicitly in like the symbolic realm. Um, and it just kind of burned the people involved, unfortunately.
Yeah. But they precisely weren't doing it on their own. They were a group.
That's true.
They didn't scale the group. In fact, the group splintered. And
Hmm.
actually, while we're talking about that, I kind of like I watched a bit of that sort of at a distance.
Yeah.
And like just from what I saw on the timeline, um one thing that really stuck out to me that I think clarifies another aspect of the like the sharpness of an edge is how much of the world it cuts off, which I don't want to be saying is just equivalent with stating the sort of foundational role of violent sovereignty in creating meaning, which I kind of suspect some of the people trolling on poll think like my problem is that I don't admit this enough. And I've been reading like Colosso, he's really into talking about that. And like, yeah, I do have to grapple with it a bit. But what I'm referring to more, especially when the violence does not actually happen, or if it actually happens, is almost always done through some sort of proxy, um, is like I would see them argue and use this kind of like these psychoanalytic reverse psychology techniques on each other. I'd see like stuff that was like I heard like a couple of them were influenced by The Last Psychiatrist, which is insane to me because I went on a big phase of him this year. And then we're using the sort of ways he talks about to detect like sort of narcissism stuff, like in exactly the ways that would reinforce it in them. And it was like this the strange thing is just, and this I see everywhere now,
Hmm.
that like if somebody else was arguing with them and said, "No, I mean this," and they'd be like, "No, you really mean this," and like no matter how many, like not even trying to sort of like walk it back, just like directly tell somebody one that they are telling them the opposite thing, and two that they are like gaslighting them to tell. It's like once you're integrating that level, like that sort of enjoyment of symbolic violence, which I also see in like the fake news phenomenon, in when people go like when it's gone beyond the point of, oh, this is a source that people actually believe and you kind of have to, you do. I think liberals were always wrong about this. You do have to engage people's reasons for believing this rather than your legitimate source. But then you'll see these people who are further down the spiral going like, source, I made it up, giga chat image. Like that kind of thing where it's like it is doing a violence against the chain of signifiers as such, because the chain of signifiers is sort of presumed to be indefinite and hostile, and so you have to just cut it off at a point that asserts yourself, but also like that can be attacked by anyone else, and it go back down these like you get these almost disintegrating chains of signifiers.
It definitely sounds like the type of self-generating mental illness I've been talking about. Um,
Yeah,
that you can like meme yourself into just destroying all type of logic and meaning. Um, the
which
I
like back in the day, remember when Chapo Trapos was like a manifesto against logic and reason? It was like and I think that's a bad idea. And I
Yeah.
hate being right.
Well, I mean, it's so funny because now Chapo is they're still they're still playing explicitly playing this role of like trying to save the Democrats from themselves, which is what Bernie and Co have also been doing. Um, and it like because they're um, like still stuck. It's kind of like an auto like they're not doing like the quite the young boy thing. I mean, well, they are, but they are trying to, uh, like, because of the ideological history there, still like trying to basically save the bourgeoisie, or the as the Democratic Party.
I
Um,
don't really think they are, actually. That's not the sense, but I don't listen to them that often anymore. I just check in. It sounds now like they're just a kind of like I'd almost describe them as like a cynical romantic barstool sports at this point.
well, I mean, I'm just talking about functionally what they're doing,
Yeah.
because like in many ways, the election that we've just had is a very classical Bonapartist kind of pattern. Um,
Mhm.
that you have the bourgeoisie are unable to rule by themselves, and all the forces like and the left basically is trying to prop up the bourgeoisie because of bourgeois freedoms, and
Mhm.
the right just adopts their popular positions and strong with a strong arm figure and wins on that. Um,
Mhm.
and what people don't like probably don't remember is that like the party of order back in the Second French Republic, they were the party of the bourgeoisie, and the Democrats are basically our party of order. And
Mhm.
the like they are totally incapable of when the moments when they do just. I mean, both parties are bourgeois parties, but they can't govern just on the bourgeoisie themselves. That's just it does the numbers don't work. So they
Yeah.
always have to create that kind of coalition. And the Democrats have basically rejected all attempts to try to bring in other class formations into coalition with the bourgeoisie. So they've destroyed themselves and their political
Mhm.
position because of that. I mean, that's my take on it.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. And I think just in regards to Chapo, it
Hmm.
seems like at least libidinally, the like 5 minutes I can check into an episode these days, they definitely seem to enjoy the sort of Bonapartist acceleration more than the continuing like monotony of the party of order. Now, I don't know what that will look like actually in it, but like they were not making any sort of like attempt to push Kamala to the left this election. If anything, it was more that they would focus on the Democrats with like the implicit assumption that their listeners would be primarily focusing on and would just think like outside of he did something stupid that's funny, like would just yeah, obviously Trump's bad, and then that the badness of the Democrats is worth commenting on.
Hmm. I guess that's possible. I haven't listened to them too much either. The
Yeah.
impression that, like, what was definitely true last time around was trying to push them
Yes.
left to save them from themselves.
Right.
I don't know if that's
Right.
changed
No,
this
that
election.
was the theory of change, and I remember in 2020 like Matt Christman or like somebody saying like, yeah, our theory of like under our theory of change, there is no more way to like get a left win in America for at least a generation. Like the only way would have been to get a left figure with Bernie who could build a popular base outside the party
Hmm.
while using the messaging and organizational infrastructure of a major party, and that was our last best hope. And now I'm just gonna grill. Like,
Yeah. Yeah, I think that that does capture a certain section of the left now. Although there is like there's a struggle going on in DSA right now over what direction to take. Basically, it's between those who want to continue tailing the Democrats and those who don't. And
Yeah.
I think which side wins that battle will it'll be incredibly consequential. Um, and so that's where my all my energy is focused right now. I mean, I don't like to get too involved with ESA activism stuff,
Uh-huh.
but I think the most important thing that anybody could do right now is end the Popular Front as a thing on the left.
Yeah. I mean, if anyone makes a viable creative third party,
Mhm.
like I would absolutely like that's not my main theory of change or where my major efforts are focused, but I do absolutely think that that could be a game changer. Um it amazed me that there was not any serious like in this election. You had like RFK who just defected to Trump
Yep.
because like he was the monocult party and the Republicans are already. And you had like Jill Stein who was almost, or at least I think with her like vice presidential candidate almost doing the same thing, although I think she also like fired her vice presidential candidate or something. I don't know what the fuck happened there. Um there was but like the Greens and the Libertarians have been like already the kind of left and right aligned established third parties for ages. Um, like they're known quantities. And then Cornell West, who
Shot
like
himself in the foot right out of the
I
gate.
liked a lot of his platform. As far as I can tell, he did not even really try.
Yeah.
Like,
I mean, if he should have just stuck with the Green Party because he kept changing his mind, and it's like, no, if you hesitate, you lose. You get one shot.
yes,
You're two max.
yeah,
um, but so that was disappointing. But I really hope that all my I'm like I've bought into the classical neo-Trotskyist kind of literature now, of like, oh, we need to have a party that doesn't isn't doesn't go into coalition with the Democrats, and that's the most important thing. And you need to have factions because that'll allow us to have like this better under like it'll fix some of those problems of ossified kind of systems of science and ideology. Um,
yeah.
but
Well, the very hard thing for that, and I like I'm not saying this to discourage it. I think this is going to be the really interesting problem to solve for whoever tries to solve that is going to be how to communicate between the different like I know you said no fact, but like the different like ideological perspectives like mutually polarized that emerge in a formation like that
mhm,
because it is almost like one of the basic kind of like one of the things I've seen as a problem getting almost anything, even getting like Twitter alternatives off the ground, where like people will see anything they don't like on Blue Sky or Mastodon or whatever else the
mhm,
fuck, and just be like, oh well, not worth going there. I don't want to like join these people, and this is assumed as a positive action of joining, whereas just staying on Twitter is neutral. It's just like
uh-huh,
default and like the same thing with I could even describe like the call out dynamics with like independent media and marginalized media the same way. People will talk about that as if it's completely just dependent on or like downstream of identity. Like why does every like trans woman who makes an indie game get canceled, but you're still watching Marvel movies directed by guys who've been Me Too'd. And it's like, um, on one hand, identity absolutely plays into that, but on the other hand, it's also like watching the thing that's in theaters is almost like a non action. Whereas, like, taking a risk on and promoting somebody's like obscure indie content is an action that has to like engage and represent your full identity.
right. No, there's. Oh, I totally get what you mean. There's so many barriers to try to get people to overcome that inertia. A blue sky thing frustrates me so much because it is just objectively one a better product. Two, the fact that I've written about like how important the AT protocol is in potentially creating like a new cyberspace, basically, and people are just obsessing over the most superficial details of what's going on. It's like, oh yeah, that's what the culture's like there. They're all rad libs who are extremely annoying. But that you can go there and change the culture. You can create a little circle
Yeah,
with you and your friends, and not have to deal with that. Not deal with Twitter ads or all
yeah,
the bots and bullshit. And you, like you, it is what you make of it. But people,
yeah,
there is a certain passivity that's been socialized into people um, in engaging media and stuff like that. It's in the great like there's very few ruptures in internet history that really break that inertia, and I have been fascinated with by that because people go kind of insane, but they are there's a palpable energy when it happens of um well, people can really change things by like it is almost like a revolutionary thing when that inertia is overcome, which is kind of silly,
right.
but it is. And this is how I felt when I first like saw like the dollars meeting in Dura, and I was like 14 or 15. And
Mhm.
it was the first time I realized that people together, collectively, have power, which is kind of an absurd thing for me to learn that way.
What?
Um,
Yeah. No, I get that, and I get that. Like, I it's absurd that we're saying it's absurd because this
yeah,
is theoretically the whole insight underlying both democracy in the liberal sense and the left in a radical sense. Like
mhm,
both of those are supposed to be entirely premised on that. And if you say it directly outright, it's like it seems unspeakably naive now. Even if you consider yourself on the left and you could be like, this isn't an authoritarian versus libertarian leftist thing, you can put yourself anywhere on the compass and find some cope for like why your ideology doesn't actually entail having to believe.
yeah. I mean, it certainly, I think, just shows how silly David Graeber's voluntarism is. Because people don't just decide uh, political formations on the whim. They don't even decide what social media platform they're going to use necessarily on a whim. Um, they determine it from this whole like symbolic structure that they've created for themselves of which not necessarily just for themselves but like they are that is created in culture
Yeah,
and I this is why I love Althusser's theory, especially his late theory, the philosophy encounter, because I think it lays out exactly like there's just these particular moments that things collide and suddenly anything like what happened before is all kind of canceled out. It doesn't determine what happens next. And it's kind of those moments that are like the radical freedom of
yeah,
history and humanity.
yeah. And there's a whole paradox there of like, I guess, what seems like messianic waiting and simultaneously a command of action,
Yeah.
which and Tikkun themselves are particularly, I'd also describe them, I guess, as like voluntarist and very, very characterized by, even their name is like a reference to like Jewish messianic ideas.
Mm,
And like, they're also they're the same people who wrote the Invisible Committee. I need to go back and read as another one of these like 2000s proto young boy pre like internet revolution era texts that is now somewhat infamous for Glenn Beck going on TV and being like, this is what Occupy Wall Street protesters actually want. This is what they actually believe.
So I don't
Like,
really. So the Invisible Committee, was that? I might be forgetting what that is. Was that the EndNotes thing? Was that inspired by
no,
Bakunin's
Endnotes is later.
Invisible Dictatorship?
Endnotes is like the contemporary, like, I guess, like inheritors of this lineage,
Okay.
this kind of like French post lefty like lineage. But Tikkun was sort of like Tikkun and the Invisible Committee, as I understand it, and I may be wrong about this, were basically the same entity, but Tikkun was sort of like the cultural front, and the Invisible Committee was sort of like the political front.
Hmm.
And they were both anonymous, although a few of them actually did get identified and went to jail for something.
That sounds a lot like the old anarchist like Bakunite idea of
Yeah,
the invisible dictatorship, um, as opposed to like the dictatorship of the proletariat. So you just do everything like have a secret society that is gonna fuck things up and pull things
yeah.
together.
I do think we are very much moving into like a parapolitical era. Is if
Mm.
mass politics is not like if mass politics is either like entirely governed by, I mean, hell, I'd say even like Trumpian mass politics. One of the reasons that like nobody could follow, nobody predicted this, not nobody, but like that this election result did not seem to match anybody's perceptions of how it was going while it was running was that like the Trump campaign in the parts that were traditionally understood as political campaigning was really weak because it was focusing on everywhere else. Like every sort of possible sphere of networking and society and social media, these hobby kind of spaces, like identity spaces, community and local groups, all these things that are considered apolitical or, in the classical anthropological sense, parapolitical spaces became extremely activated by people who are not like on paper campaign officials. Um, and within a system where those kinds of spaces are going to be the main avenues of political contestation, especially if like institutional democratic structures start to break down, you could very much have a period where that kind of organization becomes the dominant way factions try to get their programs like realized.
Right. I will say one thing that we talked about at the beginning of the conversation, um, it was relating to like Trump, or it might have been before we started recording. I will like continuing on the line of that. It's a very typical Bonapartist pattern. I don't think it'll necessarily lead to the Bonapartist like destruction of the republic necessarily, um, because it's not. Um, like in order to do that, in order for Bonaparte to have done that, he needed the support of the bourgeoisie, and Trump has like a certain section of the bourgeoisie in the Republican Party. He has the richest man on earth for a while, Musk, but he doesn't have. I don't think he has any kind. There's any political will there to say screw it. We're just gonna be done with this democracy thing because it'll backfire immensely. It's not. It is a fundamentally much more stable type of rule than what anything that Trump could offer, which wasn't the case in like the Weimar Republic or the Second French Republic. Um, I don't see that happening. And if he tries something like that, it will probably backfire immensely.
I mean, I think that will is there. It's among the sort of like the Vance and Teal and Anderson contingent most of all. But like even then, I do see that like the paradigm of I think both Russia and China, which Trump was always aligning the US more with, even China, even with the fucking trade war shit, like he had a lot of money when people were investigating where his money came from, like in Chinese investments.
mhm.
And like they in the Chinese internet sure fucking loves that like he's coming out on top, which is itself this kind of like it's not necessarily identical with the will of the party, it's more like the will of the people under the party, which is
Mhm.
itself this kind of mechanism that the fixed parties can now use to shift their own ideologies on like under a sort of democratic pretext. And both China and Russia have this thing where it's like Russia just sort of whittles away at the integrity of its formal democracy. It still has it on paper, but almost every element other than that. And
Yeah.
China does the same thing with its communism. It just like keeps like retains the forms while hollowing them out.
Mhm.
And that's kind of that prevents having to deal with too much of explicit uprising because you can kind of just constantly keep the level adjusted right, like just right where it would provoke any kind of inconvenient resistance. You keep it just below that.
Yeah. I think that, well, to China's credit, they do have like a genuine state capitalism, which is more than
Yeah.
a lot of other people can say. Um, but it I do get what you're talking about. I think that what like it Russia doing that has, I think, tremendously undermined their system of government. Um, it
Yeah.
probably will not. I don't. It'll probably change dramatically. I think after Putin dies, because
Yeah.
he's undermined so many of the other institutions. And this is a fundamental thing. This is part of why communism fell in the first place. Is that their democratic centralism basically destroyed any possible civil society from the top down. Um, but in a way, we are doing something similar in the West, in liberal capitalism, except we're doing it from the bottom up. And it's this
Mhm.
trend of social atomization, which I've wrote about like 4 years ago now, that has basically been going on for hundreds of years, ever since capitalism started. But it accumulates. It keeps getting worse because it doesn't get better at any moment in time. Um, and it's destroying. We've seen how like this, like all the bowling alone stuff, it is dissolving civil society, and it's the reason why those like it that chuny young boy kind of phenomenon exists, because there's no longer these civil society operations to socialize people properly. Um,
Right. But there's also, and I guess like the young girl
mhm.
already represents this idea of a kind of neoliberal intervention in what socializes people properly in like an atomized world. And that's where there's different stages of atomization corresponding to young boy and young girl. And it is still significant when you say that Chuni has why it's possible. Like many things about Chuni, like historically, are just like the romantic poet. Like
Yeah.
Chuni is already it's the referring to this probably also needs explanation to at least some of the audience. Like
Yeah.
this Japanese trope of middle school disease, as in like when a middle school student starts pretending they have like psychic powers,
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the signifying register of it is taken from the 90s Japanese occult boom, which is itself just drawing on the whole of like largely European as well as traditional Japanese like aesthetic and high cultural and religious and esoteric symbolism the way goth did.
Mm-hmm.
And like goth works because you can always kind of cast back to the past for these images. Um, and what seems, if anything, characteristic of a period where these all get rolled up into one thing and conflated is that it's hard to imagine agency or history any other way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that what has kind of evolved is what I think is really essential to it is like the self delusion aspect. Because like the particular like oh they think they have magic or something is a uh, um, I, is like a subcultural like historically contingent thing. Um, when like there's you can play like a self delusion game even with very immediate social relations. Like you can
Mhm.
have like I brought up at one point on Twitter like the movie or the TV show Paranoia Agent, a fantastic show.
Yeah.
And there's two characters and they're two young boys who have who like are outwardly seem very normal, but inwardly have these intense like self-delusional things that force them into confrontation of like these social games that they're playing with each other to try and destroy each other socially because they have this self-delusional importance to them um, and that and um, in like the early 2000s and 90s that could be a purely like social thing. Fast forward 10 years, and it's all that thing is just the internet, right? That is how it's
Mhm.
expressed, or something similar, or it's the internet, basically. I think, um,
Mhm.
and um, I think it's useful. Like it certainly, there's always been gaps that have allowed people like this to emerge. I and like I think it's related to um, like in the Second French Republic, Bonaparte's like partisans. He had journalists that backed him. They were called the Society of the December 6th, or like which was the day he was elected or something. Um, and uh, it was like these were basically what Marx described as um, lumen proletariat, uh, or at least what the way I would describe them is like lumen proletariat intellectuals. Um,
Mm.
is people who have who are like marginalized by the state, but have performed this like intellectual labor role of creating an ideological state apparatus. Um,
Okay, this I really need to read.
Yeah, well, read his stuff on the Civil War in France and the 18th Brumaire. Very important
Uh-huh.
stuff. And I think that you can it's kind of missable. You have to do a little bit of background research on what he's talking about. Um, but but basically, I think that this is the throughput or the through line through all of history of this like of the lumpen proletariat intellectual because what everybody's trying to do when they're not just like self deluding themselves in isolation, um, they're trying to when they're trying to attack like the symbolic thing as like they're the young boy and they're trying to destroy this sign that they've associated with the system with the young girl. Um, they are acting like an ideological apparatus um,
Yeah.
that's kind of, but not more to the state. And it's kind of like uh, a virus in a sense of like a free floating DNA that is trying to
Yeah,
be inserted into something that has it's this code that has meaning but isn't connected into this thing yet. Um, and I
yeah,
think this is how a lot of social evolution happens. Actually, is that there are usually like ideologies that are suppressed that society can kind of fall back on when things stop working. Um, and but what we've kind of created is what I would say is that what the internet and what modern liberal capitalism have created in particular is like a engine of mutation, like a source of
yeah.
radiation that is causing an accelerated rate of mutation around us. And
But
that's how I
also
would.
constrains the evolutions of the mutation, or the evolutions of the mutation are constrained pretty effectively by manipulating the conditions. Um, in a lot of ways, there's been a collapse in ideological diversity since like the lefty pole years of the first Trump administration, when everyone was declaring their own like
Right.
three hyphenated ideology, the way people on Tumblr in the Mogai era were doing with genders, because the sort of competitive forces and become just just completely take over the ecology,
Hmm.
which is part of the function of the young boy. Like I have the chapter on war, and a lot of this is like mimetic war as a weaponized mimetic evolutionary pressure.
No, that's exactly right. I think that's true. Um, that like, and this is what we see with virus. This is what happened in COVID, literally, with the actual COVID
Yeah,
strains, is that they all kind of coalesced around a certain type that was successful. And there's definitely a mimetic evolution on the same lines. Um, I guess, but the question um, is that like the conditions um, uh, of evolution that are going on, it's not going to necessarily produce something like its environment isn't one of taking over the existing state. Like the niche of the state apparatus is still
yes,
occupied.
yes,
It is trying to coexist with it in a symbiotic fashion. That is what is
yeah,
makes possible like its continued existence.
yeah. No, and I do think, insofar as you were saying earlier, I've been able to pick up some things that most of the like internet studies stuff doesn't. Like mainly, I think the thing I'd attribute that to would just be the fact that I take lumpen intellectuals seriously. Like
That's
I think
important.
lumpen intellectuals deserve to be read in primary sources, deserve to be like understood, and in many ways, I align myself more with them than I identify with academia at this point. Like I'm trying to get my thesis finished just because I've already sunk a bunch of money in it. But as soon
No,
as I'm done that, I am out.
no, I
Um,
totally get what you mean. I'm
Probably.
in the same boat. I mean, we're both basically internet cranks at the
Yeah.
core of it. And I think that's the best place to be right now because nobody reads academia anymore, really. Um, you have to be engaging with these online media forums if you want to be reaching anyone. But for better or for worse. So I think
There
you're
was
making the right
one
call
other.
there.
Yeah. And I guess like the sort of whole discourse about whether the left is too academic almost comes down to this thing where it's like the left was given like the sort of like falsified Gramscian move of the 60s,
Hmm.
where it's like, okay, we'll take over a bunch of the ideological state apparatuses. And the state's like, yeah, sure. And we'll take, while you're doing that, we'll take over all these lumpen intellectual apparatuses, and you can just and just straight up auto coup. Like it's like that easy to deal with that strategy.
Well, I mean, it'll be interesting to see exactly how this turns out because I th-
It's not even just that we'll auto coup, it's that like those apparatuses will organically turn against the ideological state apparatus anyway.
Mhm.
So we'll just have that energy on our side, which is like is a natural proletarian energy.
Right. But I think that this betrays a certain weakness of the system, not a strength. Because for a long time it was a strength that the left was in academia and providing these critiques of capitalism, because they provided new ideological bases of like the evolution of the state and capitalism. It provided a means of coping with like capitalism as like a revolutionary force of
Mhm.
constantly changing things. Um, and uh, and a certain and it was definitely a very bloated way of doing that. It's like this. It's just a big problem with the bourgeois state. Is it's a professional um, state that has like to pay for all these like professionals that are specialized in um, creating ideology and trying to shape people's interpretations, which doesn't actually feed people or anything like that. It just keeps the system somewhat stable. Um, and this, what exactly will the result of like the Lumen proletariat taking Lumen proletariat intellectuals taking the center stage will have? It could be
Yeah.
quite destructive to capitalism itself, if not done. But they kind of have a safety net because in order for it to fall apart, they're kind of, I mean, it can fall apart, but in order for it to be replaced by something, there has to be an alternative. Um,
Yes.
and this is like what I was writing about with like fetters and stuff. That they're right now like the only like socialism that can succeed is one that works. It can somehow that can do better than capitalism.
Mhm.
And just like it doing worse makes that easier, but you still have to build the alternative somewhere somehow.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's been my problem with the kinds of like vulgar accelerationisms and
Mhm.
a lot of the theories of the event that I see coming out of everyone from Zizek to Berardi to Badiou during COVID, for example.
Yeah. I mean, this is. I mean, I like the accelerations thing to me was kind of what was going on with Biden's investment plans and like
Yeah,
industrial policy stuff. Because if you maintain a high wage growth and high investment rate, you're going to run into a profitability crisis sooner rather than later.
which
Um,
is remarkable because that's what everybody seems to hate him and have like throwing him out over.
yeah.
Um, and like its effects on like yeah, running a I feel like we're at this point where again there's too many reversals to even keep track of because it's like okay you're running essentially an accelerationist hidden revolutionary program from the top
Yeah.
while trying to stay aligned with the bottom. It's like
Hmm.
that's too many layers. That's like if that's what the Democrats were doing, it's like that bit in HPMOR where Lucius Malfoy uh, tells Draco, takes him to like the Death Note play, and is like, in real life, your plan should never have this many steps. It's gonna fail at one of them.
Well, I don't think they were conscious about the accelerationist
Yeah,
aspects of it, because the Keynesians love deny. They never acknowledge that this is the outcome of their
yeah,
policies, and I've confronted them about it many times. But the but it should have been. I mean, if you look at what actually happened, I think this is. I honestly think that the way things played out was kind of like a quirk of the way we monitor economic statistics.
Yes.
Because if you look at the wage fund, which um, okay, sorry about that. Um, uh, if you look at the wage fund, which is just like how much wages are people being paid, and you get a real number for that and divide that by the population. You don't even have to divide by population necessarily, but if you can look at that and you can see that from the perspective of the working class, there was basically a pretty moderate, good sized recession, about the size of the one in 2000, 1990, that happened between 2022 and 2023. And we're only just beginning to recover from. But that's not reflected in GDP numbers because profits were doing great. Or like the corporate profits, like surplus was a little bit more uh, funny, but it was like the GDP numbers looked fine. Wage numbers looked fine because wages are calculated on like by surveys of people who are employed, and unemployment looked kind of okay. But if you like look at how like it's really the intersection of those things, of what how much people were
Mm-hmm.
actually getting out of it, and not just like
Yeah.
these individual dimensions of it, people were not doing good, and you would have been
Yeah.
recognized as a downturn, a significant downturn during that time if they had looked at it from this perspective. Um,
And like the thing that's memory hold now is like people learned like in 2008 what
hmm,
people learned including from like the liberal mass cultural reception or interpretation of that event was like don't trust the numbers. Like the economists have their own like that this was sort of everyone knew the crash was coming in 2008, but like it didn't show up on the right kinds of measures, so they thought everything's doing fine.
yep,
And even that this was a kind of deliberate like plan to enrich themselves.
yep.
So when the mainstream media then just is like, oh, why don't people trust the numbers? It's like
Because you don't, they don't even
we've been
understand the
here
numbers.
before. Yeah,
It's really stupid. I mean, it's understandable, but it's still stupid. Um, and there, there was a lot of hubris associated with that. But I think that, I mean, if Trump will probably continue down on a similar path regardless. He probably, obviously, they won't like send checks to people again, um, but there'll probably be continued industrial policy, and wages will probably um, uh, wages did pretty good under Trump last time, so we'll see how that turns out. Although I think that COVID kind of saved Trump a bit from a natural downturn that was beginning to take form in 2020. Uh,
yeah,
so he kind of got lucky on that record. But I I think that uh, uh, well let's go back to like the young boy for a second because
yeah.
um, the big thing was that they're like um, all these lumpen proletariat intellectuals are now who have like these young boy sort of motivations and dynamics as psychically are now closer to power than they've ever been really in the U.S.
Mhm.
Um, and like I'm like what is that like what do you think it looks like when the dog catches the mailman? Um,
Well, I really have no clue at this point, and I've
uh-huh.
always been saying like I really have no clue. I throw out some like almost like fantastical predictions in the book just as a kind of rhetorical exercise, but that's not the kind of
Mm-hmm.
prophecy I tend to do. But like, um, the thing that concerns me is I think we've seen a few examples of this already, actually.
Mhm.
Like I said, we've already seen in Russia, and I think Russia in 2022, and then Israel last year have been the predominant examples I've seen of like a country in a poster spiral with all the violence that is usually like that usually stays at the level of rhetoric. And like the US and Trump in theory was supposed to be that, but Trump actually just stayed in office and posted. That's been like the irony of it. It feels like the US is being so stable while exporting its spectacle to the rest of the world because the US is such a culture of spectacle that it just stays there.
Yeah.
Um,
And there's,
but like, yeah,
but I mean, there is like a counterweight of young girlness to Trump, of because he
yes,
loves the glamour and the
yeah,
success of the high bourgeoisie, and the appearances in mass media, um, that like he's just kind of like this auto stabilizing aspect to it that it isn't like that is still chaotic, but doesn't but it's like a chaotic attractor because it
yeah,
never explodes outwards in quite the way you would expect.
yeah. And to be fair, young boy politics has been getting more that way as it gets more established.
Hmm.
You can kind of track the movement of lumpen intellectuals on the internet from like literally anonymous figures on forums
Right.
to YouTube guys who talk in front of their camera awkwardly for an hour to nowadays like influencers who have to be like supermodel fit and
Hmm.
like better marketers than Hollywood stars.
So you do kind of in the book talk a bit about how there's a somewhat emancipatory potential in there. Like between the two of them, it can only be on the side of the young boy because it's the only one that actually has like a libidinal motivation against the system.
I
Um,
mean, I would qualify this actually because I do at a couple of points, and this is like you could critique this as almost like philosophically comphet of me and maybe attached to the traditions of alchemy, but I really do think that there also is no way out without a synthesis. That part of the problem of the young boy is that he denies even maybe not the revolutionary in a negative sense, but the vital potential in the young girl in that idea of the everyday as like I mean for me it's like the revolution can't happen if you can't imagine an everyday that would be better and
right.
a like reason to live in it once it is. Like um, that's the thing that in denying the young boy most always ends up undermining himself. But that also, yeah, you absolutely also need the young boy. And I think when I most wanted to get to this positive or emancipatory moment when you were talking about Shuni, because Shuni is a concept I mostly have positive personal associations with. It's something I almost try to embody as an aesthetic practice. And like, I think the reason for that is related to like Chuny having the power to manipulate symbolic pain imaginatively, not just by attacking them at their links. Like there's that problem we were talking about earlier with Marxists not wanting to remember after the revolution, wanting to imagine after the revolution versus like ideologues just build like the trad people just building their like Lego block world with um
Uh-huh.
perfect Minecraft Germanic castles. Um and honestly, actually, I feel like I'm over like this is gonna get attacked by the vitalists, but like the Chuny is really this like last psychiatrist talks about the decline of the ability to fantasize and that like for instance being replaced by porn in sexuality is part of this thing that makes us more dependent on the fantasies that are provided to us by the spectacle.
Right.
So like Chuny retains the ability to fantasize at the cost of being considered delusional because under the young girl, any fantasy is considered delusion. And then the range of what can be defined as fantasy is just directly dictated from above by the spectacle. It's in fact it's a genre distinction. One thing I feel like in the wake of the last election, I find myself having to struggle with is that like people can't imagine their life's genre could shift and even shifting into a significantly different political order than a capitalist or neo capitalist or neoliberal one is like a genre shift. It's like having to imagine yourself, which the liberals in the resistance moment after 2016 attempted, but unfortunately attempted through slop with the whole like we're Harry Potter and Luke Skywalker moment. And the young boy lumpen intellectuals on the internet are very good at like forming these puny imaginal personas and projecting them to their followers and like convincing themselves that they live in the genre that they want to live in. Um, whereas the left and the liberal like established intellectuals have the same problem of constantly sort of disclaiming their imaginations and saying like we know it like almost like the ironic quips in like Marvel movies where it's
Yeah.
like we know this is just fiction. We can't take this too seriously.
Uh-huh.
Um so that's really where I think that Chuny and the problem with the young boy as a formation without like the dialectical alliance of the young girl is it will negate that Chuny itself as soon as it starts to become too cringe, to become too sort of like
Right.
independent uh, of the like dialectic of war. Um, and that's why like so much energy, why again you get both ideological and like gender or like cultural diversity collapse.
And you know what it
But
oh, go ahead.
yeah,
Well,
I guess just to bring it back around is like that puny will to like both become the ideal or the abstraction
mhm,
um while also having the will to live in the world.
right.
That would be the synthesis that I think any revolutionary or liberatory politics will require from here on in.
Yeah. I totally agree with that. And I think that um to further the theme of what it looks like when you catch the mailman, I'm reminded of when you were talking just now of Alexander Dugin and his biography a little bit, because when he was living in the Soviet Union, he was essentially a fascist. Um, and then when it fell, he was had this like not like an about face necessarily away from the right, but had this kind of revelation like about face away from fascism because then he felt that like the Soviet Union had this like essential quality of the Russian soul that was now being destroyed by capitalism in the post Cold War Russia, um, and um, it's definitely one of those like symbolic positions of rebellion that he kind of like kept chasing, and I think there'll be an aspect of that with people under Trump, like the MAGA communism stuff is not tenable because they have to maintain that symbolic rebellion under Trump, and certain people will like uh, follow that logic,
Yeah. I
but
mean, the question is also going to be what if this faces
mhm,
actually significant. Like I've talked about. I remember like 2017, the first Trump era, as being it's like when I really came into online space. It was when it felt like there was this just wildly imaginative intellectual potential all over the internet because everybody thought, wow, meme magic actually works.
yeah, yeah,
Whatever
yeah,
my thing is could be next. Now, the difference in the second Trump era, and I do want to like not even caution, this isn't about like positive, negative prediction. This is about
mhm,
like update your priors and prepare. Is I do think that could look different under real intellectual repression, which has not been
true.
seen in the West in a long time.
I also
As much as like the cancel culture and like I mean that
yeah,
is it's that's just the ideological state apparatuses being the ideological state apparatuses.
yeah,
And I think the biggest case for a like liberal doctrine of free speech, which everyone has dismissed from their own positions for a while, is that like there is a qualitative difference between the ideological state apparatuses regulating the ideological state apparatuses and the ideological state apparatuses regulating everything else.
mhm. There is like it definitely there is a degree that matters a lot because between Trump 2017 and Nazi Germany, there's actually a lot of space there than you might think. Because like the Prussian state had a lot of censorship and repression, but was also like this hotbed of the same imaginary you were talking about.
Right,
Um,
right.
and I'm and hopefully it'll be if it does go down that road, it'll be more like the latter. Um,
Again, I'm not saying that it won't. I'm
okay,
not
I
in the
mean, who
predictions
knows?
business.
Yeah.
I'm saying the in Russia it was that because those people had that. The causality flows the other way.
Hmm. Yeah, I
I
definitely
guess
think.
I'm almost being like I do have some sympathy still for the sort of like workerist thing where it's like self organization is primary, like everything else is almost superstructural.
Hmm. I mean,
Just because I think that's more useful to think from.
I definitely think you were right when you were talking about earlier that there needs to be this synthesis of young boy and young girl. This is why, and there's definitely been a kind of like rejection of that type of serious thinking, even from strange quarters that you might not necessarily associate it with, like the degrowth stuff. That
Yeah,
they are very rarely take seriously this imagination of what comes next because it's always this particular. It reduces down to these popular narratives about uh, how we can just decrease time worked and that'll fix like material throughput being lower and there's a lot of things not thought through that because they can't really imagine a situation um, besides just capitalism as it exists now, but smaller. Um,
Climate change is the single most psyoped like political issue. I actually think it doesn't even look that way because everything else is being like psyop to distract from it. When culture war stuff started emerging around 2013, I started being like, "Wait, what the fuck? Why is nobody talking about climate change anymore?" But like also the people who do talk about climate change, it's exclusively. I went to a meeting for an organization I won't name that like anytime I would try to like talk about any solution other than like do something shocking enough to force bourgeois politicians to do something we haven't specified, like they would just like reflect your question. They just like didn't even acknowledge it and would start talking about the same thing again.
yeah, that's a pattern that shows up in a lot of like NGO organizing stuff. Sorry. Um,
No, I do think that's, I guess, like that's the reason I also try and keep it a big part of my like agenda and focus. I
mm,
mean, there's been this big shift towards denialism where effectively the mechanism of climate denialism is like that whole just jouissance of cutting off the world thing, just being like, I don't believe it because the people telling me about it are so fucking annoying that I
yeah.
want to just deny their existence by denying this fact.
hmm Which I'm sure has a certain rationality to it in a world
Yeah,
where, like, I mean, they don't control anything that could limit climate change.
yeah,
That everything, like, intersocially, that is the game you're playing, um, which explains a lot of what happens because it really, and this is the problem of bourgeois liberal democracy to begin with, is that people have these very binary choices of expressing either satisfaction or dissatisfaction with the way they perceive the system going. And like there's these whole bundled like ideologies, systems of science associated with each party, what have you. But nobody has rights and duties to actually wield power responsibly. And nobody is socialized in such a way where they would take seriously um, wielding power, basically. Uh,
yes. This
except,
is a thing that's part of why I got so big into the last psychiatrist kick. I also think like the young part of young boy and young girl is important, and I almost don't know any like Tikkun work that has like aligned it with the politics of childhood directly enough.
Mhm.
Because I mean, we can talk about the whole concept of extended adolescence as like a as a factor in this, and I'm sure many people would say I'm a case too. And like all the sort of like the young boy and young girl represent these two different forms of it. The young girl is the form that like remains obedient in this extended adolescence, even to just the projected big other as soon as the actual parents or institutions disappear. And the young boy just like mindless self-indulgence, you can rebel to anything.
Yeah, there's. My mind went to Bioshock, the original, and like the phrase like when near the climax where your character is being beaten with a golf club. It's like a man chooses, a slave obeys, um, and um, in a lot of sense, that kind of psychology is like pervading this whole thing. And the difficulty is that in the current situation, um, the growing up is paradoxically associated with becoming obedient in a lot of ways.
Yeah,
And this is also, we've talked about this on Twitter and stuff. Is like this is also the paradox of the Evangelion rebuild movies. That
yeah,
all of this comes back to what's the solution to all of these problems. It's just grow up and deal with 9 to 5 and get over it.
yeah. Like, um, yeah. The other thing that I also feel is that like a lot of the dynamics of like online spirals just look like direct like regression moments,
Hmm.
and a lot of the social dynamics that I built theory of the young boy around are almost like almost directly patterned on things I'd see in socialization on the playground in literal elementary school, particularly the gender stuff.
Right. That definitely, I think, is very powerful because people, um, like the playground dynamics are everywhere now, and it's all, and this is like the gender discourse is that, and the internal, like not just like gender versus like male versus female, but the internal gender discussions, internal to each gender, um, and like, but and this relates to like I think that um like the really important thing, the emancipatory thing is um like you have to grow up to choose, to figure out, to understand, to learn how to choose, to learn how to control your fate in some way. That's
Yeah,
like the real growing up, that
yeah,
is like made like is so incredibly difficult, um, but is like the actual historical duty that we've been given.
yeah. It's both individual and in groups. Like the Jordan Peterson clean your room thing. You can argue
Hmm.
like it can't be one or the other. Like it has to be both.
Right.
Um, but yeah, I think that's a good cue to just wrap this up and
Sure.
for
Yeah,
me to
we're
go
going
back
pretty
to being
long.
30.
Yeah. No, I really appreciate you coming on and having this discussion. This has been great.
Thanks. You too.
Yeah.
I'm yeah. We yeah, looking forward to talking more sometime maybe.
Yeah, that'd be
And
great.
anyone who anybody who listens to this reading theory of the young boy or anything else we have at Ondata Express like Hollow House, it's our um, serial fiction journal with 8 ongoing novels, all free, all online. Actually, when we were talking about like what the future with the young boy in power looks like, um, Swords Under the Phosphor Sky by uh, Nakosatva is a pretty powerful and explicit vision of that. Psychogramma 2 to a lesser extent.
No, definitely check that out. I'll probably check that out in the coming days. It's really good stuff there.
Cool.
And I'll put this
Yeah,
up on, I'll probably share this on my Substack uh, once I
cool.
edit this.
Thanks. Good night.